The back tires of my 18-wheeler still hummed in my ears when I pulled my pickup into the cul-de-sac, rolling through the quiet suburb like a beast retreating to its den. My eyelids ached from 14 hours on the interstate, the hypnotic rhythm of asphalt, headlights, and truck stop coffee still pulsing through my bones. All I wanted, the only thing I could think of as the summer sun bled across the rooftops, was this: park, shower, nap. Simple. But fate, it seems, likes to throw curveballs wrapped in floral sundresses. I slowed to a crawl as I hit the bend in front of my house. The first thing I noticed wasn't my own driveway, but what wasn't my driveway. A catering van big enough to feed a wedding had squatted across it like some smug metal toad, brazenly blocking the only legal place I could tuck my truck. I squinted, thinking maybe I was seeing double. Nope. The van's chrome bumper sparkled like it owned the place. Perfect, I muttered, dragging a palm down my grimy face. My pride and joy, my battered, dust-crusted truck, needed rest just as much as I did, but apparently my driveway had been zoned as communal storage for somebody else's soiree. Scanning the street, I realized it had transformed in the hours I'd been gone. A pastel paradise stretched across Karen's front yard like it had been ripped straight from a Pinterest board and slapped onto real life. White folding chairs lined up in the grass, tied with bows that fluttered in the sticky summer breeze. Tables gleamed under starched linens, exploding with delicate glassware and trays of hors d'oeuvres I couldn't even pronounce. And balloons, dozens of them, bobbed like pastel sentries guarding her kingdom. Karen's kingdom. I didn't need a program or tickets to know who was behind this production. My stomach nodded. On any other day, maybe I would have circled the block, found some miserable side street, and trudged back to my house like a half-mile pack mule. But my limbs throbbed with exhaustion, and my brain was fogged with the miles I'd driven through 3 states. My house was right there, my spot, my patch of asphalt with my name on it, at least in the mental map of my own sanity. With nothing left to debate, I jerked the steering wheel and nosed my truck into the space right in front of my house. The clunk of gears and hiss of brakes silenced whatever careful playlist Karen had been blasting to set her champagne mood. That's when I heard them, the gasps. The kind people save for seeing someone drop a wedding cake or a child swearing in church. I killed the ignition, shoved my door open, and swung down, my boots crunching against the curb. Still clutching the one thing keeping me vertical, an overfull travel mug of coffee, I had about half a second to consider whether I should brace for impact. And then, right on cue, the turret of Karen's metaphorical castle swung toward me. She burst out of her yard, a floral sundress clinging tight and a straw hat tilted like some battlefield helmet disguised as Sunday fresh. She could have been anyone's cheery aunt, if not for the thunderstorm ripping across her face. "You have 30 seconds to move that rusty heap," she shrieked, the words slicing through the humid air. "Or my guests will have your head on a platter." I stared back, one foot on the curb, steam from my coffee ghosting around my chin. Her voice had blasted across the cul-de-sac with the precision of a siren, and every eye in attendance turned toward me like I'd just set off fireworks in their pastel paradise. Their sparkly glasses froze midway to their lips. A tray of finger sandwiches paused halfway across the grass. It was the image of suburban serenity suddenly staged as a courtroom, and I was already being tried as the defendant. The crime: parking my truck in front of my own house. "Karen," I croaked, my throat raw from engine fumes and caffeine fatigue. "It's my house. My truck. I'm parked in my spot." The explanation slammed into her like a cat hissing at a hurricane. Her face flushed deeper than the strawberries lined neatly on her dessert table. Whispers rose behind the row of wine glasses, polite, sharp whispers that buzzed like mosquitoes. A small army of picture-perfect neighbors exchanged looks, their pastel colors clashing with the ugly steel beast I'd just anchored in the middle of their garden party photo shoot. Karen snapped her clipboard against her thigh with the reverence of a priest hammering holy law. "This neighborhood has rules," she hissed. "We have standards. Do you want my guests from the city council forced to walk past that?" She pointed, an index finger sharpened by years of micromanagement, at my truck as though she'd caught it streaking naked down the street. I sipped my coffee, deliberately slow. "It's on a public street," I replied, my voice calm but sleep-deprived enough to drip with dangerous indifference. The crowd rippled. Someone coughed behind their hand. A woman in pearls leaned to her husband, whispering too loudly, "This is why the HOA exists." Karen's hat brim shivered as she squared her shoulders. I could practically hear the gears in her skull grinding. How dare I not instantly fold, not melt under her scalding decree? Her sundress flashed like a warning flag as she planted herself with arms crossed. If she'd had a scepter, she would have swung it. "You're ruining this entire event," she shrieked. "Do you think anyone wants their photos ruined by that eyesore?" Her gaze stabbed into every square inch of my truck's steel body, as if sheer disdain could melt tires. Now, a saner man might have backed down to keep the peace. But fatigue can be funny. It strips away your patience, brands your nerves raw, and sometimes leaves a very simple answer humming in your chest. "No. I'm not moving it," I said, sipping again. The steam clung, the bitter heat grounding me in the surreal spectacle unfolding in front of my tired eyes. "Not tonight. Not for your party. Not for anyone." And just like that, the tension solidified, thick as smoke, choking the cul-de-sac. Karen's cheeks burned crimson. Around her, champagne glasses tilted toward lips not for celebration, but to stifle smirks. My refusal hadn't just sparked a disagreement, it had lit the dynamite under her throne. For a second, she just stood there, trembling like a kettle before the whistle, her jaw clenched so tight I could hear the grind of her perfect teeth. And I realized, I wasn't just some tired trucker anymore. I was a villain in Karen's kingdom, a defiant stain in her curated kingdom of roses, balloons, and lawn perfection. And villains, in her story, didn't walk away quietly. By the time I finally trudged inside, coffee still scalding my tongue, I didn't feel triumph. Not yet. Only a strange buzz in my veins, somewhere between adrenaline and bone-deep exhaustion. I'd done what any sane homeowner would have done. Parked at my own house. But this wasn't just a house. This was Karen's kingdom, and her crown had been tipped in front of witnesses. And if I knew anything, after years of gritting my teeth at her passive-aggressive memos, her clipped remarks about curb appeal, her iron grasp over the homeowners association, it was this: Karen never lost without a fight. The spark had caught. The fire was coming. The next morning, the battlefield revealed itself in the most suburban way possible. A single folded note tucked under my windshield wiper. No flames, no smashed glass, just a looping cursive scrawl on pale pink stationery that reeked of perfume sharper than diesel fuel. "Your vehicle is a blight on this neighborhood. Move it within the hour or I'll have it towed at your expense." And signed, but really, who else? Only Karen weaponized cursive like it was a legal threat. I crumpled it, tossed it on the passenger seat, and headed back inside. But something in my gut twisted. Because this wasn't just an annoyed neighbor venting. It was a declaration of war. By mid-morning, the reinforcements arrived. 2 men in neon safety vests came strolling up the street with clipboards, snapping cell phone photos of my truck like it was the scene of a crime. They circled it, crouched low to frame the best angle, muttering things like, "unsightly and impacting neighborhood value." "Morning, fellas," I called, stepping off my porch. My voice was casual, but my pulse thudded in my ears. "Routine assessment," one of them grunted. "Possible community code violation complaint." "Complaint from who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. A shrug. "Anonymous." I didn't even need to glance across the street, but I did anyway. There she was, Karen in her wide-brimmed hat, pretending to prune her roses. She wasn't even good at pretending. A gleam of smug victory radiated from the way her shears snipped thin air. I marched closer to the inspectors. "This truck is legally registered, insured, and parked in a public space in front of my property. Unless you're with city code enforcement, you've got no right being here taking pictures." The men exchanged a glance. One muttered something under his breath about overreacting homeowners, but when I stepped forward, just enough to make my boots crunch loud on pavement, they both shuffled awkwardly, stuffed their clipboards under their arms, and scurried back down the block. Across the street, Karen's shears paused mid-air. I didn't wave. I simply bent to scoop up a handful of gravel, let it fall back through my fingers, and turned for the house. In wars like these, silence says more than screaming. It wasn't long before neighbors started picking sides, quietly at first, like bettors watching a boxing match, afraid to back the wrong fighter. By noon, Mrs. Hensley, who lived 2 houses down, waddled over with a tray of cookies. Her floral apron puffed in the breeze, making her seem harmless, almost grandmotherish. But the steel in her eyes told me she'd been around Karen's kind before. "Don't you let her scare you," she whispered, offering me a warm chocolate chip cookie like it was an alliance treaty. She did the same thing to the Peterson boy last summer. Tried to get his camper towed before their family barbecue. And the year before, oh law, she nearly caused a scene because someone's shutters weren't painted the right shade of white. She leaned close, conspiratorial. "She won't quit until she breaks you. But you, maybe you're the one who won't break." The sweetness of the cookie didn't take the bitterness out of her words. But it added something else: resolve. By late afternoon, Karen's tactics shifted into a siege. She circled like a hawk across her lawn, whispering to her friends, her minions in sundresses with pearl necklaces that glinted in the sunlight. They glanced at me, then huddled, then scribbled on clipboards like generals plotting troop movements. Around 3 o'clock, the main event hit. I stepped outside with a duffel bag of tools, expecting nothing more than to haul my things inside. Instead, I found Karen marching straight up my driveway with 2 of her allies flanking her. It was almost comical, like a PTA mafia shaking down a rival. "You can't just park that eyesore here when I'm hosting high-profile guests." Karen snapped. Her voice quivered with the shrill edge of someone both furious and desperate for control. Her lieutenant chimed in, clutching her pearls as though my truck personally offended her sense of morality. "The city councilman from downtown will be here tonight. He can't be expected to walk past that thing." I glanced over my shoulder at the gleaming pickup, sun striking its hood in a flash of chrome. To me, it was beautiful, rugged, reliable, an honest machine that had carried me thousands of miles and kept me fed. To them, it was dirt smeared across their curated paradise. "You're welcome to take it up with city traffic if you want," I said flatly. "But until then, it stays where it is." The silence stretched. Long, tight, thick as rope. Karen's face contorted, the perfect pastel image shattering into something raw and sharp. She jabbed a finger at me like she was exorcising demons. "You think you're clever, but you're not. You're just a selfish man dragging down this whole neighborhood. And believe me, this is not over." The slam of her heels echoed down the driveway as she spun, sundress flaring like a villain's cape. Her allies followed, whispering furiously. And just like that, the parking dispute became something bigger. By early evening, her subtlety was gone. Shouts erupted 2 houses down, where Karen had cornered Steve, mild-mannered, soft-spoken Steve, accusing him of conspiring with me because he'd parked his sedan down the block. Steve finally snapped. His voice boomed across the yards. "You don't run this neighborhood, Karen. Mind your own business." I happened to step outside just in time to catch the fireworks. Seeing a usually quiet man push back against her sent shockwaves through the cul-de-sac. Neighbors peered from behind curtains like spectators at an arena. Some smirked behind their hands. Karen spun toward me, finger trembling as she pointed. "This is your fault. You and that truck are poisoning this community, ruining our reputation." But the crowd wasn't with her this time. The tide had shifted, just barely, like the first ripple before a wave grows, but it was there. That night, under the dim glow of the porch light, a certified letter slid under my door. Thick paper, HOA stamped in bold at the top. I opened it, already guessing what I'd find, and laughed. Violations. Infractions. Pages of fabricated nonsense, unsightly storage, hazardous obstruction, negative community value. Threats of fines, threats of enforcement. Each sentence a clumsy attempt to bury me under red tape. It would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. I sat on my porch steps, the letter in one hand, coffee in the other, staring at my truck gleaming proudly under streetlights. To anyone else, it was steel and rubber. To me, it was defiance carved from chrome. Karen wasn't bluffing anymore. She wasn't nagging. She was escalating, hurling every ounce of influence she had at me. And I realized something in that moment. This wasn't about a truck. Not anymore. Karen ruled this neighborhood through fear. Fear of gossip, fear of retaliation, fear of being the next victim of her clipboard crusade. Everyone bent, everyone caved, because it was easier than fighting. But I hadn't bent. I was still standing. And that made me dangerous, not just to her party, but to the entire shaky empire she'd built. So maybe that's why, instead of tossing the letter in the trash, I pinned it to the corkboard in my kitchen like a trophy. Proof that the war was real now. And proof that this time, Karen had picked the wrong neighbor to bully. As midnight fell, my phone buzzed with texts from neighbors. Most anonymous, a few bold enough to sign their names. She's furious. Careful, she isn't done. Thank you for standing up. Don't back down. I leaned back in my chair, listening to sprinklers ticking faintly down the block, the smell of cut grass lingering on the breeze. For the first time all day, I felt something sharp and strong cut through the exhaustion. It wasn't fear. It was exhilaration. Because whether I liked it or not, I'd become more than the guy with a truck fueling Karen's rage. To the people watching, the ones trapped in her grip for too long, I was something else. The spark she wanted to crush had lit a bonfire instead. And in the quiet hum of the cul-de-sac, with Karen pacing her living room like a caged animal across the street, I knew one thing for certain. The war had officially begun. The letter demanding my presence at the emergency HOA meeting might as well have been written in blood. It was delivered by hand, slipped under my door with the kind of flourish only Karen could muster. The words were typed neatly on official paper bearing the symbol of our association, but the intent saturated every syllable. The message was clear. This was no friendly gathering to share community updates. This was her battlefield. By the time the next evening rolled around, the neighborhood pulsed with anticipation. Curtains trembled as residents peeked out, children were ushered indoors early, and the usual hum of sprinklers and lawnmowers was replaced with a prickly silence. Everyone knew Karen had set her sights on a public spectacle. She summoned me to be shamed, expecting me to fold beneath her gavel, her voice, and her carefully gathered audience. I had dealt with storms far more dangerous out on the road, but my pulse still kicked nervously as I approached that beige clubhouse at the end of the street. The building looked plain from the outside, a squat box of bricks usually reserved for bake sales and discussions about fence maintenance. Tonight it glimmered faintly under floodlights, windows glowing with the heat of bodies crammed inside. I pushed the door open, boots echoing against polished tile as every head turned toward me. The air reeked of cleaning solution mixed with the nervous sweat of neighbors eager for drama. The folding chairs had been set up in neat rows like pews in a church, and nearly every seat was filled. At the far end of the room sat Karen, perched proudly at the head of a long table. She had chosen her outfit carefully. A pale blue dress that conveyed authority without severity, pearls draped at her throat, hair pulled so tight it appeared to strain her smile. She sat with her shoulders pinned square, posture straight and head lifted in a theatrical way that gave her figure the aura of a ruler enthroned. Beside her sat two loyal board members, their faces stiff and obedient like soldiers at parade rest. On the table before her gleamed a gavel, although no HOA meeting in living memory had ever required one. She had brought it like a prop in a stage play. The meeting opened with her voice. She began slowly, savoring each word. She spoke of neighborhoods as sanctuaries, of beauty that must be preserved, of unity and cooperation. With a few clacks of the gavel she pivoted to darker notes, describing threats to harmony, destabilizing forces, careless residents who placed their own whims above the collective. Then she turned her eyes upon me. The entire crowd followed. She described me as a disruptor. She said I had parked a vehicle too large for our streets, dangerous to pedestrians, offensive to visiting guests. She described my actions as deliberate sabotage against her carefully organized event. She had facts, she claimed. She had witnesses. She painted a portrait in which I was the villain poisoning an otherwise perfect community. Every sentence dripped with drama, her voice cracking at rehearsed points as though rehearsed indignation had finally broken free. I sat there quietly, watching her, listening not just to the words but to the way they bounced around the room. Some nodded along as if under spell, while others shifted uncomfortably. Her story was polished, but its edges cut deep with exaggeration. I waited until she finished, until her final line glowed in the air like the last flicker of a staged monologue. The room was hushed, her allies gazing proudly at her, her smile confident as she folded her notes and looked at me with a glimmer of triumph. I rose slowly, placing my yellow pad of notes upon the table where every eye could see my calm hands. My voice was measured, not raised, but firm enough to carry. I stated the facts clearly. My truck was lawfully parked. It was registered, insured, and not obstructing any driveway, hydrant, or traffic lane. I reminded the room that the HOA's handbook contained no rule permitting temporary seizure of public space for a private party. I recounted with calm detail the note taped to my windshield, the contractors parading around my vehicle, even the attempted tow truck. Each act was intimidation, not enforcement. Each was orchestrated by someone determined to turn personal preference into fabricated law. At first the room stayed silent, but as I laid each piece of evidence in plain view, faces shifted. A murmur rippled among the rows. Some glanced at Karen for reassurance, but she did not meet their eyes. She leaned forward in her seat, knuckles whitening against the table. When she interrupted, her voice had sharpened. She barked that my presence endangered property values. She swore she had authority to protect the community from negligence. She accused me of disrespect, of arrogance, of stubborn defiance. I picked up my phone and held the bylaws high so all could see the screen. With deliberate calm, I read passages aloud, naming the specific sections that proved her arguments hollow. I showed the absence of a single line banning residents from parking on public-owned portions of the street in front of their homes. Residents shifted again, this time toward me, uncomfortable with her claims, now intrigued by the precision of my defense. Her calm began cracking. I could see the pink climbing her neck as each sentence tightened the noose around her claims. But Karen had never built her reign on logic. She had built it upon fear and intimidation. And when that faltered, she clung harder to performance. She slammed her palm against the table, rattling her gavel, insisting she represented the image of the neighborhood, that without her standards this street would resemble a junkyard. She gestured wildly at me, a flare of her hand as though to brand me with disgrace. And then it happened. A voice cut through the heated room, raspy but strong, familiar in its steel. Mrs. Hensley stood from her chair at the third row, steady even as gasps surrounded her. She looked directly at Karen and declared that enough was enough. She spoke of the years of bullying the neighborhood had endured. She reminded everyone of the families told to repaint shutters, of the boy forced to move his camper, of the countless small humiliations. She said openly what no one else had dared to admit, that Karen had turned leadership into tyranny, and this so-called crisis over a truck was only the latest example. The silence was startling, but it did not last. More murmurs rose, whispers swelling into full sentences, residents nodding, exchanging looks that brimmed with relief. For years everyone had wanted to speak, and now the first stone had broken the wall. Faces turned toward me, some even offering faint smiles, gratitude brimming behind cautious expressions. Karen stood abruptly, shouting across the table. She declared the meeting out of order, her voice shrieking that this community had been hers to maintain for years, that all she had done had been to keep standards high. Her gavel cracked against the table again and again in a frantic attempt to restore control, but each strike carried less authority than the last. The image of her composure had fractured. I waited with patience, allowing her fury to wash over the room. Then I delivered the final line. I reminded the association that leadership meant service, not domination. I reminded them that written rules govern, not one person's personal preference. And I made it clear that intimidation through false notices and harassment was unacceptable in any community aspiring toward harmony. For the first time in years, Karen had no immediate comeback. She sputtered a few broken sentences before storming from the room, sundress flashing as the heavy door slammed behind her. The gavel lay twisted on its side, abandoned, no longer a symbol of power but of desperation. Neighbors erupted in mixed sounds, some clapping discreetly, others whispering rapidly, their voices brimming with relief, disbelief, and above all change. I gathered my pad and walked slowly toward the exit, feeling a dozen approving nods as I passed. For the first time since stepping into this neighborhood, I felt less like an outcast and more like a catalyst. Something had shifted in those walls, something Karen had never anticipated. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. The morning after the HOA meeting, The neighborhood had changed. Not in appearance, not in the tidy lawns or the sparkling windows, but in the air itself. The silence carried weight, like a taut wire stretched across every driveway, waiting to snap. For the first time in years, Karen had not walked out of that clubhouse victorious. Her voice had not drowned the room, and her rules had not silenced complaints. The cracks in her reign had widened into something visible, undeniable. But power does not slip so easily from hands accustomed to gripping it. She had been embarrassed, and humiliation was a fuel more potent to her than champagne or gossip. Her house sat quiet that morning, blinds drawn, curtains shut. That kind of quiet was not surrender. It was the gathering of storm clouds, the breeding ground of her next attempt to drag me under. I could feel it in my bones, a sense honed by miles of highways and years of knowing when the road ahead hid trouble just beyond the bend. By late afternoon, the first strike landed. A plain envelope appeared on my doorstep, sealed with the HOA crest but carrying sharper venom than any letter before. It was addressed directly to me, and inside waited a notice made to look official. The words were bold, written in the kind of font meant to mimic legal weight. The language had grown harsher, no longer implying inconvenience but outright threatening action. According to this notice, my truck was not just unsightly but a public hazard, condemned as dangerous to children and destructive to property values. Within 48 hours, it would be forcibly removed if I failed to comply. The document carried 3 signatures this time, Karen's bold strokes lined by 2 of her board members. She had leaned on them, twisted them, and dragged them into her fight. I called my lawyer friend that evening. He laughed dryly after reading a copy of the letter I scanned over. No teeth, he said. Empty words masquerading as law. They had no power to tow a legally parked vehicle from public street space, no matter how much ink they threw at me. But hidden in his humor was frustration. He could see what I did. She was not aiming for justice. She was aiming to exhaust me, to make me move not out of obligation but to escape her endless obsession. I pinned the letter to my refrigerator. Another trophy, another failed swing. But I also steeled myself, knowing this was only the beginning. The next morning, more evidence of her desperation rolled in loud enough for the whole block to hear. A tow truck lumbered down the street like a summoned beast, circling past my driveway before pausing behind my truck. Its engine idled, a low growl reverberating across the cul-de-sac, neighbors peeking through blinds to catch the show. I stepped out the door before the driver even set his jaw toward the hook. I leaned against the side of my truck, arms crossed, phone already recording. He rolled down his window. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as he explained he was responding to a city call reporting an abandoned vehicle leaking fluids. I gestured to the spotless pavement beneath my wheels. Not a drop of oil, not a grain of dirt larger than what came from the passing streets. I told him plainly he had no authority to touch what he knew was not abandoned. And then I glanced across the street. Karen stood on her porch with a plastic watering can, pretending to sprinkle her flowers though the spout never poured a single drop. She was watching with hungry eyes, waiting for the hook to sink into my truck so she could gloat about its removal. The driver, uncomfortable under my glare, muttered about misunderstanding, shifted gears, and drove away. I did not cheer. I simply raised one hand to wave at her before heading back inside. That wave burned her worse than words ever could. The following days turned petty. Small annoyances stacked like stones. My trash cans tipped over each night, garbage spilling across the curb as though some invisible hands toppled them in the dark. Flyers printed with phrases about community standards and harmonious appearances appeared on my lawn with the dew each morning. Neighbors whispered that Karen had begun a new kind of campaign, not with rules or gavel, but with words, smears, and rumors. She spoke of me as dangerous, of my vehicle as a polluter, of my presence as corrosive to children and fragile property markets. It was absurd on its face, but repetition plants seeds even when soil is rocky. I saw the hesitant looks from those walking their dogs, the quick second glances at my house, curiosity tinted with doubt. They wanted peace, not war, and Karen was determined to paint me as the reason peace had fled. It might almost have worked, had she not gone too far. One humid afternoon, I returned home to find my truck coated in sticky notes. Dozens upon dozens, slapped across windshield and side mirrors, curling in the sun until they hung like flags of childish defiance. Each one bore scrawled insults, written in varied handwriting to create the illusion of collective anger. Ugly trucks don't belong here. Move it already. Respect your neighbors. Words penned by adults acting like children hiding behind colored squares. I peeled every note carefully, stacking them with deliberate patience while Karen watched from her blinds. She was waiting for me to lash out, to rip them down while screaming, give her the scene to twist into her next performance. I did not provide it. I pressed them flat, placed them into a folder, and locked them away. Evidence. That night I called my brother. He had always been the type to meet force with steel, to confront problems head-on without hesitation. He did not hesitate now. He arrived the next day, his own truck rumbling down the cul-de-sac before parking it directly behind mine. Together they stood like sentinels, two relics of strength lined nose to tail. My brother leaned casually against his hood, sipping coffee as though this was nothing more than a social visit. But the message was unmistakable. I was not alone. Word spread quickly. By midday another friend appeared, camera in hand, promising that whatever unfolded here would not remain untold. Karen emerged at one point, lips pressed tight, fists clenched at her sides. Her eyes darted from my truck to my brother's, to the cameras, to the neighbors gathering quietly along the sidewalks. For the first time she looked small. That evening she retaliated in a new way. Flyers appeared across every doorstep, glossy and professional, paid for by the HOA but written with venom steeped from Karen's hand. My truck's photograph was printed in the middle, labeled with words like unsafe and corrosive to the neighborhood. It accused me of reckless disrespect, of endangering property values, of being an obstacle to the well-being of children. One by one, neighbors read them. Some frowned. Some shook their heads with disgust at the obviousness of the smear. Others carried theirs straight to me, voices firm in support. Mrs. Hensley smacked hers down on my porch table, her face flushed with righteous anger. Steve followed, muttering that he had been shouted at last week for failing to move his own car, and that he was finished playing into Karen's paranoia. Slowly, allies were revealing themselves. Her lies had not only failed to separate me from the neighborhood, they had begun to pull the neighborhood from her. Karen must have felt it slipping, because that very night she stormed across her lawn, face pale with fury, voice shrill and trembling with rage. In the glow of porch lamps and under the eyes of nearly every neighbor standing outside, she screamed at me. She shouted that I had poisoned the community, turned friends against her, destroyed harmony she had built for years. I listened silently until her tirade burned itself still. Then I answered in a voice steady and calm, loud enough for all to hear. I explained that I had parked where I was allowed, lived by the same written rules as everyone, and endured harassment with patience. I said aloud what everyone already knew deep down. The problem was not my truck. The problem was her need to control, her hunger for obedience, her belief that fear was stronger than community. The silence that followed her retreat was broken not by whispers, but by claps. Quiet at first, then growing, neighbors applauding softly, courage flickering through the crowd. Karen slammed her door so hard the glass rattled. The war was still alive, but the neighborhood had changed. The cul-de-sac wore a new face the morning after Karen's latest outburst. The grass still gleamed with dew, sprinklers still snapped in revolving arcs. Children still pedaled bicycles down the street with streamers flashing in the sun. On the surface nothing had changed, but beneath the calm something fragile had cracked and would not mend. Neighbors who once hid behind curtains now lingered a little longer by their mailboxes. Their conversations held less fear and more curiosity. They had witnessed arrogance splintering into desperation, and though no one voiced it aloud, we all understood the shift. Karen's house sat quiet like a bunker after bombardment. Curtains drawn, blinds angled. Her figure visible only in fleeting shadows pacing across rooms. She no longer paraded in her garden. No more clipped roses or staged chats with allies at the fence. It was not the silence of surrender, though. It was the silence of plotting. The kind of stillness that warns of another strike loaded in the chamber. I had seen storms gather on the horizon during long hauls that carried the same heavy promise. They looked quiet until suddenly they were not. That afternoon, the hammer dropped. A man in uniform appeared in front of my house, clipboard heavy against his chest. His badge did not announce HOA authority but city enforcement. His introduction was polite, almost courteous, but the weight of his task was clear. He said he had been called multiple times within the last day to investigate complaints of commercial vehicles causing hazards and damaging neighborhood aesthetics. He gave no names, but none were needed. The signatures were invisible but unmistakable. Karen had escalated once again, leaping beyond neighborhood theatrics and dragging city bureaucracy into her fight. I walked him around the truck. I pointed to the license up to date, the inspection sticker signed off only weeks before, the spotless pavement showing no leaks or hazards. His pen scribbled, his brow furrowed, and eventually his tone softened. He admitted he had been called repeatedly by the same voice. He promised the report would close clean, no violations applicable. I thanked him, and he left shaking his head, muttering that some citizens had far too much free time. Across the street, Karen's blinds snapped closed, a sharp gesture like a slammed fist. She had watched her plan fall apart again. I thought perhaps she would pause, reconsider, but Karen never paused. That evening another blow arrived not through inspectors but through a smiling stranger carrying a stack of glossy flyers. They had been distributed across the entire block, each bearing my address and a photograph of my truck. The words screamed across the page in bold type accusing me of negligence and labeling me as unfriendly, unsafe, unfit for community life. At the bottom, purporting to represent the HOA, sat not only Karen's signature but those of the board members she had bent beneath her will. The flyer campaign shocked even those accustomed to her antics. Some dropped the pages at my doorstep with quiet apologies. Others shook their heads, anger rising not against me but against her obsession. Mrs. Hensley was first to speak aloud what had been bubbling beneath polite facades. She hobbled across her lawn, flyer in hand, waving it like evidence, her sharp voice declaring she was finished with Karen and her bullying, that the time had come to stand together. Steve joined before long, his voice louder. His frustration evident as he told me directly he supported me and would no longer bow to whisper threats. By dusk my driveway had become an unlikely gathering point. Neighbors trickled by, some hesitant, others bold, but all of them tired of the endless campaign. My brother leaned against his truck watching with satisfaction. Every nod, every whispered word of support, built a wall around me, the kind of wall Karen's power could not breach. Perhaps that was what finally snapped her composure. As twilight sank over the roofs, Karen stormed from her house. Her footsteps rattled the sidewalk, her voice already rising before she even reached my yard. Her face flushed red, words tumbling out in furious streams. She accused me of destroying everything, of poisoning her friendships, of undoing the years she had spent building her kingdom of order. She jabbed her clipboard like a weapon, screamed about rules no one else could see, demanded that I bow and yield and remove what had become to her more than a truck, a symbol of defiance she could not kill. I let her vent. The crowd of neighbors listened with rigid silence, more fascinated now by her unraveling than frightened by her rage. My brother stood ready at my side but did not move forward. He knew as well as I did this confrontation was no longer physical. It was a war of presence, of endurance, of whose will would remain at the end of the shouting. When her voice finally faltered from the violence of its own pitch, I spoke. I did not raise my tone. I addressed her and the audience alike, my words deliberate and steady. I pointed out calmly that laws existed beyond Karen's clipboard. I reminded them that her rules were not written, not voted on, not official in any capacity. I said what many had long felt but never dared to voice, that harassment disguised as leadership is still harassment, that intimidation is poison, and that neighborhoods can thrive only when people protect one another instead of bowing to fear. For a long breath the street hung silent. Karen trembled visibly, her lips parting as though to spew more fury, but no words surfaced. Neighbors shifted. Some crossed arms, some nodded firmly, some whispered openly to one another instead of averting their eyes. And then the first clap came. It was quiet, hesitant, a single sound beating against the silence. Others followed. Clap after clap, until the street rang with the sound of support, no longer hidden behind blinds and whispers. Karen's face twisted with betrayal. Her eyes darted across the crowd but found no loyal gaze, no allies rushing to her side. Her mouth formed broken words of protest, her voice a quake of denial, but momentum had left her. She turned sharply, storming across the street, slamming her door so hard its echo rattled shutters. The neighbors lingered afterward. Some pressed hands to my shoulder, some spoke thanks, some simply smiled, relieved that someone had refused to bow. In their faces I saw a truth older than any handbook. Karen had thrived because people gave her permission. That permission had been revoked. As night settled, I sat once again on my porch, truck gleaming in the lamplight, my brother sipping quietly beside me. The air felt lighter, like pressure released at last. Karen's blinds remained closed, but I could still sense the burn of her anger boiling behind them. She would not forget, and perhaps she would try again. But now she no longer commanded the silence of the neighborhood. She had been revealed, stripped of her crown, her followers scattering. For years people had feared her. Now they pitied her. The war had begun with a parking spot. It ended here, not with my defeat, but with the death of her authority. She had thrown everything she possessed against me, and I had refused to move. In truth, I had done more than stand against her. I had shown the neighborhood that they could, too. The cul-de-sac finally exhaled, and for the first time since I had set my boots on this street, I felt peace. My truck remained exactly where it belonged, quiet sentinel of a battle fought and somehow won.